am to be a representative of my people, the Berewa Kanto and Dakota, but I always try to emphasize I'm honored to be representative of them, but I do not speak for my people because I am just one of many. So hello from Sweden. So I'm going to go ahead and open. I really appreciated in the main room that we paid attention to the breath. And I want to kind of just take a moment to do the same with you in this smaller circle, mostly because I really feel that it's important that we acknowledge the challenges over the past 2 years. So just taking that moment to acknowledge all of you and the collective experience that we had the past 2 years through this pandemic. So I'm going to ask each of you to join me either in your chair or where you're standing. Just feel your feet into the ground. We're going to do just a little bit of grounding here. Okay. Just get a sense of where you are presently. Then we're just going to take a deep breath together. So I'm going to invite you to breathe in through your nose, and then we'll hold it for just a moment, and then we'll exhale slowly through our mouths. Okay. So again, grounded where you are. Let's go ahead and inhale through our nose. Hold it and exhale.
Okay. Oh, I've got it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I thank you for just breathing with me. Sometimes we forget how important it is to breathe and connect. So we're going to go ahead and get started with some stories. Storytelling is, as we know, is a very, very powerful way to connect. And it's a way that Indigenous people around the globe have persisted throughout the generations. It's through stories that we know who we are, where we come from, and really how to live as relatives in this world. So science is really catching up with a lot of the Indigenous knowledges that people have held for generations and generations. You know, as an educator working with learners who have experienced trauma, I've even read studies that tell us that storytelling has the power to heal the brain from trauma. But even without science, without the studies, we understand that storytelling is powerful because it connects us with each other. So even in this virtual space, we're connecting. Before I get started with our stories, I would love for everyone to just briefly share. So I'm going to invite you to take a healthy risk. This healthy risk to either unmute your microphone or share in the chat. But I would love to hear from you all. You know, what is or what are some of the stories? Maybe name a story or two that has made an impact on your lives. And then just briefly tell us, you know, how have these stories shaped who you are as human beings? Come on, guys, healthy risk. I'm going to create a safer space. So again, if you're more comfortable sharing in the chat, what is a story that has made an impact on your life, and how has it shaped who you are as a human?
I can get started.
Go ahead. What's that?
It was me, Abba.
Oh, okay. Did you want to share one of your stories, or?
Yes, I can get started if I may.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yes.
My favorite story is, I think most of you maybe know, it is the Pippi Longstocking.
Yes.
I think she is just great, and it has also shaped maybe not my personality in that sense, but I'm often thinking as she is thinking, and especially the issue on I have never tried it before, so why not?
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that, taking that healthy risk. If I had a door prize, I would give it to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your personal experience. So for thinking about what we did just now, and even if it was just one story that was shared, you know, we're joining each other in this virtual space, and we got to learn a little bit about Dr. Ebba. And That's the power of story. You know, she was brought back to her childhood. I have fond memories of Pippi Longstocking as a child too. So again, that's the power of story. So I'm going to share one of my favorite childhood stories, and it's also one of our ancient Lakota stories. And I want to share this as a way to set up our discussion on Wo'owachi. It's a plan for indigenizing educational landscapes, because storytelling is an indigenous pedagogy. And it's a central way that we in South Dakota and in my current city, it's a way that we're indigenizing education. So Iktomi and the Ducks, again, it is a very ancient story among my people, but this is, you're going to see a published book. And so while this is published, I don't want to take away from the fact that this was an oral story originally. And this particular publication was created by Lakota elders from the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation here in South Dakota. So you'll see some of the translations were very literal, so there's a lot of repetition, but that's kind of the way we speak, through repetition. And so the English script was written by Paul Little, and then the Lakota script is by Harold Condon. It's a very short story. Okay, so one day, Iktomi was walking by the water. He saw some ducks swimming, but the ducks didn't see him. Iktomi was hungry, and he wanted to eat the ducks. He thought of a way to trick the ducks. So Iktomi pulled up some tall grass and sticks, and he tied them together, and he put them on his back, and he started walking past the ducks. When Iktomi walked by, one of the ducks said, "Iktomi, hey, what do you have on your back?" Iktomi answered, "These are good songs. I'm taking them to a powwow over the hill." Iktomi began to walk away. Another curious duck said, "Hey, can you sing us a song? Just one song, please." Iktomi finally gave in to their requests. "I will sing you a song, but you must listen and obey to what I tell you to do." The ducks agreed to do this. So Iktomi lined the ducks up, and he told them as he started to sing, "Close your eyes and dance, close your eyes and dance. Whoever looks, your eyes will turn red." The ducks closed their eyes and danced while Iktomi sang. Then Iktomi picked up a big stick and he hit the ducks on the head. He killed many ducks. Finally, one duck opened his eyes and saw Iktomi hitting the ducks. The young duck yelled, "Hey, open your eyes! Iktomi is going to kill us all." So the last ducks flew away. So I love this story. I have fond memories of listening to it growing up. It was a favorite that my mom used to tell all of my siblings and I. And she loved this story too, because it was a story that she was told by her grandmother. So it was passed down through the generations in my family. But more importantly, the song is important because of the lesson that it teaches. And this particular lesson has had many applications on situations in my life over the years. So let's take this lesson and apply it to the educational context. From an educational context, I want you to think about who or what is represented in this story. So for example, who is Iktomi? Maybe who are the ducks? So again, prompting a healthy risk, go ahead and unmute your mics and maybe share who you think Iktomi represents, who the duck represents, or maybe share that here in the chat. I've got no idea. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. I appreciate you for that healthy risk and sharing that. Okay, the ducks represent Native Americans. Okay, perfect. Oh, maybe Iktomi represents danger. I hope the ducks aren't the students. Wow, that's powerful. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and unpack it. Thank you again, everyone, for taking that healthy risk and sharing your thinking with me today. Let's go ahead and unpack how I interpret these characters. So Iktomi. Iktomi is a trickster in our culture. And a lot of times Iktomi is represented as a man, but he's also a shapeshifter. And so sometimes he can present as an animal, or he can present as inanimate objects or things, issues in our communities, such as substance abuse, things that harm us. In this particular story, I really see Iktomi as representative of the system, so our educational system. We know that in communities where learners and families have been historically marginalized or oppressed, the educational systems don't always work for us. They don't work for us unless we completely assimilate, and as evidenced in this story, comply or obey. Then maybe those systems will work for us. So when we comply or obey with those systems, we give into the oppression that exists and that these systems are designed to maintain. So the songs, Iktomi's bundle of songs, these songs might represent the promises that oppressive systems in education give to our people. Now, note that I say that they're systems of oppression. So these are the ones that perpetuate the inequity, and they really don't serve to empower or to set certain learners up for success. So we look at Iktomi's bundle of songs as the promises of these oppressive systems. And then finally, we have the ducks. And I'm sorry to say, Diane, in this story, the ducks do represent the learners, the families in these communities that have been historically marginalized or oppressed. But the ducks also represent others, and they might be educators or school leaders, because we understand that educators and school leaders, we struggle in these same oppressive systems as well. So collectively, if we stay in these systems, none of us will benefit from the fake songs in Iktomi's bundle, because the opportunities that they represent, they weren't made for us and they weren't made with us. And so educators in this instance, we grow tired of fighting the system, and often we leave the profession, essentially dying off. And then with the learners, we know of the disparities in educational success, achievement, attendance, and graduation. That's essentially how the learners die off in these systems. So the reason why I tell you this story and why I present the representations within it is really because of the lesson. And the lesson that we need to learn is simply that we need to open our eyes. This story provides a snapshot of the educational landscape for Indigenous communities. And I know that this is an international conference, so I'm not quite sure how many of you are aware of the history of education for Indigenous communities in the United States. And this could be a semester-long course to go into all of the details of the history of Indian education. So I don't have the time to deeply dive into that topic, but I do want to briefly share some elements of what it looks like and how it impacts our communities today. So back in the 1800s now, as you may be aware, there had been very systematic approaches to genocide of our people since European contact in the 1400s. And so that continued throughout the centuries. And in 1887, they continued it in a different way. And so federal United States policy on educating Indians was enacted in 1887. So you might hear me going back and forth calling our people Indigenous, Indians, American Indians, but really what I'm talking about are the collective peoples who lived here prior to European contact. So after, the genocidal practices and such, then came the policies around assimilation. So basically, General Richard Pratt was one who coined the phrase in the late 1800s, kill the Indian to save the man. So children were taken from Indigenous families, and often at the threat of violence, withholding food rations, imprisonment, and they were sent to these boarding schools, sometimes thousands of miles away. Now think about that just for a moment. If you have a child and you are told that you must give your child up or be forced into prison, you're not going to be fed, you're going to be starved because our people were put on reservations. I can't even imagine what kind of a choice that would be to make, because ultimately, regardless of what you chose, you were going to have your children taken away anyway. And so what this did was it caused generations upon generations of trauma and violence and loss of cultural identity. So behind me, I'm sharing a picture of the most infamous school here in the United States. It's Carlisle Indian School, and that was located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So picture of some of the young people who were taken from their homes, and then pictures of them 3 years later. Oftentimes the children who were taken first were the children of chiefs, because they were to serve as an example. You know, if the chief's children were taken or sent, then the other families would fall in line. But as soon as they arrived, they were stripped of their clothing, their hair was cut short. And in our culture, our hair is a very sacred object. So for them to be humiliated in such a way was really traumatizing. So they weren't allowed to speak their language. A lot of times they were beaten or severely punished if they were caught speaking their language. And over time, you know, they lost every sense of who they were. And if these children ever made it home, a lot of them were home without their cultural identities and didn't fit in. So again, this perpetuated generations of trauma, and that still persists today. I'd like to remind you that we're really not far removed from this harmful legacy. This photograph here is of my grandfather. So my mother's father, Alexander Wakeman, and he was a student at Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Here he's wearing his athletic shirt from Carlisle. So through stories of our grandparents' experiences, our grandparents, our aunties, and our uncles, our communities have known for many years about the violence that these young children endured in these boarding schools across Turtle Island, which is the United States and Canada. You know, they told us and they told others about what they experienced. And sadly, a lot of people outside of our communities did not believe their stories. And it's only begun recently, like within the past year, that people are finding unmarked graves of these murdered children who didn't make it in these boarding schools. And so the Every Child Matters movement is reverberating across Turtle Island. This is really our opportunity to honor those children who were lost. And we're taking back our cultural identity and demanding that our accurate histories be shared. So very, very brief rundown of the history of Indian education in the United States. I just want to pause for a moment. Again, that was by no means an extensive history, but just to pause for a moment, maybe think about these questions and feel free to share in the chat. But as I shared that history, what did you see? What did you hear? And how did it make you feel?
So I actually learned about this. I'm taking a class on genocide, and we learned about this. And I think what they did is really horrible. It's like literally trying to take away a culture. And like, who are you after that? So that must have, and it has had, generational traumas and generational like curses in a way. Like, that was so impactful in the worst way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Diane shares in the chat, unimaginable cruelty and suffering. Yes, absolutely.
Hi. If I can just add to that, like I learned about the Carlisle Indian School because I took a class at Dickinson College when I was in high school, and it wasn't really until I became a mother that I really like when you learn about it, it seems like, well, this was other people a long time ago, and people were backwards back then, and white people didn't understand. And then you think when you get to be a parent, they understood exactly what they were doing. There is no way that you could take somebody's child away from them and not realize that you were thinking of them as less human than yourself. So anyway.
Thank you for your vulnerability with sharing that.
I have to echo Diane's statement that there is nothing more horrifying. And we are learning more and more about it in many places throughout this country, in Canada, and I'm sure in many other places. And the tragedy continues. we still are looking at people in many ways as lesser. And we've got to have conversations like this to change that tide, to raise the awareness. So thank you for being here and doing that.
Woope Sakowin, of course, yes. Well, I mean, I'd like to say that everything has changed now that we're in the 21st century and perfectly, living together, but that sadly isn't the case. But, we have made some strides. And so I just want to just talk briefly about what does Indian education look like today? And it is still called Indian education. So under Title VI, federal regulation, there is Title VI laws out there on Indian education in terms of funding and programming for public schools. And so, as I said, we have made some strides. And so our students still continue to fall behind their white counterparts in terms of student achievement, attendance, and graduation. And so as kind of a response to that, some states in our country, in Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, I believe parts of Wisconsin and Wyoming, have developed essential understandings. And these understandings are really meant to be integrated into the general curriculum and to be used in classrooms to increase a positive cultural identity and really to teach the accurate history of the Indigenous experience. So we know that accessing the accurate history isn't just good for Indigenous learners, but as you said, for all of us to really have this conversation and learn about it. Because the more we know, when we know better, we do better. So in South Dakota, we use the Oceti Sakowin essential understandings. And so Oceti Sakowin translates to 7 campfires, and it's collectively the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples around the Plains area. And so I'll kind of go back and forth and call them Oceti Sakowin essential understandings, but I might also just give them the acronym OSEU. So if you hear that, I'm talking about our understandings. So I'd like to just briefly share those with you first. So OSEU number 1 is about lands and environment, because it's really important to understand where we came from. What are the land bases from which Indigenous people originate? But we also have to consider, historical land bases, that's so important, right? But also, what are the contemporary issues that impact the land and environment? And how does that impact Indigenous nations as well as general society? Because those issues impact us all. OSU number 2, identity and resiliency. This really promotes a strong sense of self within learners. So for me, as being a Dakota woman, I would say, Da Makota, I am Lakota, because that's who I am at my core. So really understanding how we cultivate a positive cultural identity and tap into historical resilience, it really allows us to step into who we are. OSU number 3. This one is so great because especially with the pandemic, pandemic was challenging, but we as Indigenous people found the silver linings. And so that time really provided opportunities for us to access culture and language via social media. We broadened our access. Sadly, in a lot of our schools in South Dakota, Indigenous young people may only get 1 hour of Lakota language and culture instruction per week, if they get that at all. Some schools do a little bit better, but what we looked at with the pandemic was how to use Facebook. Groups like Social Distance Powwow really brought people from across the world together to help us share, celebrate our culture, our music, and our very unique humor as Indigenous people. OSEU number 4 is kinship and harmony. I like to call this OSEU kinship and inclusion. This essential understanding helps us understand the traditional kinship systems, but it also invites us to ask, what do these systems look like today? Is there a difference? And are the systems the same? So again, the historical and contemporary balance. Number 5 is oral tradition and storytelling. We still have access to amazing storytellers in our communities. Albert Whitehat, who I have pictured here, he is no longer with us, but he has left some amazing stories and books that I've used myself to inform my own cultural identity. So his books reach everyone. We also wonder, how do we make storytelling accessible through technology? During the time of COVID and virtual learning, how did we access that? So I'm going to share a little bit about Indigenous Storytime and what we did here in a moment with that. OSCU number 6 is sovereignty and treaties. This is where we address the critical discussion about those sovereignty and treaties, and how they impact our communities today, because they have long-lasting impacts in our communities. And then finally, we have number 7, which is ways of life development. This is where we discuss, again, the traditional and historical ways of life, because that's part of our collective indigeneity. As I work with teachers across the country and supporting them with cultural integration, I always emphasize, if we as educators leave out the contemporary issues and contributions of Indigenous peoples, we really miss critical aspects of those identities. So both the historical and contemporary issues really inform and impact our Indigenous ways of being. So this essential understanding helps us to critique, helps us to discuss, how do we prioritize an indigenized education, an indigenized way of economic development in our communities, and language revitalization. So of course, March of 2020, the pandemic hit. So we had been making some great strides, at least in the state of South Dakota, in integrating the Oceti Sakowin essential understandings. But in March of 2020, just like schools across the globe, South Dakota closed its schoolhouse doors. So, this is where the ducks, us educators, really started to open our eyes. Some of the educators opened their eyes and began to see things that we'd been blind to for a really long time. We were seeing into the homes of many of our students. We were observing the lack of healthy food. Some of our students had lack of safe housing. And some of us educators realized that even some of the students had no access to Wi-Fi or equipment, computer equipment. So a lot of the tribes in South Dakota were very responsive and immediately, coming together and providing these technology things to our students so that they could connect virtually. But even for some of these open-eyed ducks, as I call them, the educators who are beginning to see these inequities, the challenges with COVID were just far too great. And so cultural integration and use of the OSCU to support learner success really was not a priority. And understandably so. This was a time when we were learning and leading through crisis. And we all know how that went. So as the year went on, for many of us, the pandemic really changed the way that we saw things around us. So cautious ducks with our eyes open, some of us explored ways to really reprioritize the Oceti Sakowin essential understandings and bring those back to the discussion. So as part of my dissertation research, I developed the Wo'owachi. It's a framework for enhancing teacher practice. So what is that? Well, Wo'owachi, it literally means a plan. But more specifically, it's not just a plan, because this plan invites us or requires us to collaborate together, to come up with this plan and hold it close, to process it, to discuss it, but then to move forward in a good way, to walk with this plan until things are fulfilled. It's really a commitment, because we know that when learners, and this is any learners, when they explore differing perspectives of themselves and others, they have the potential to increase their self-worth, regardless of cultural, racial, or ethnic backgrounds. For Indigenous youth in particular, they're given opportunities to gain knowledge about who they are and who they can become. And as a result, they do improve their school attendance, they improve their proficiency levels and their graduation rates. So for this reason, many South Dakota educators really latched on and wanting to integrate the Oceti Sakowin essential understandings. However, one of the challenges that we had in our state was that teachers and schools were given very little, if any, direction or guidance on how to integrate the OSCUs. So as a result of that, again, not knowing or not having the guide or the Wo'owachi plan, a lot of the teachers deprioritized the integration. So some teachers have continued to offer the OSCU, but again, with little support, it really, teachers need the time to reflect and think about the quality and effectiveness of their teaching with the OSCU. So Wo'owachi tends to support teachers, and it sets forth 4 quadrants of support. So teachers can self-assess their personal growth and their capacity for integrating OSCU into school curriculum. But embedded within these practices really provides them a sense of direction and expectation for the teachers to fully maximize OSCU integration. So as a result, teacher and young people together in collaboration will learn more about their own culture, those of others, and of the Oceti Sakowin people in particular. Okay, so again, unpacked quite a bit of some of the contemporary things going on in Indian education. So briefly share, what did you see? What did you hear? And how did it make you feel? Okay. I'm going to reconvene my discussion in 5. Collaboration, I noticed, is a key concept. Absolutely. I'd also like to point out, yes, lots of work to do. Absolutely. Collaboration also, when I mean collaboration, with Wo'owachi at the center, collaboration really needs to include the learner and the Indigenous communities. I always follow this practice of nothing about us without us in terms of decision making. So Wo'owachi helps you to achieve that consultation and collaboration.
I'd just like to add that collaboration has been a consistent theme throughout the conference. Last night, both speakers talked about collaboration. This morning, collaboration was key. And this idea of choice and moving forward together collaboratively. So it's like everything is coming together.
It definitely is. And so again, I love how, again, just sharing our stories, we see the connections and how we operate as relatives, even at a global level. Choice is always there. Yes. Within the framework of Wo'owachi, even the educators have choice. What are the areas that I need to work on to improve and grow as an educator? Yes, choice is so critical.
And can I learn that in a collaborative environment?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Well, as the pandemic raged on, Indigenous parents across Turtle Islands, they really saw this opportunity for reclaiming educational sovereignty. So communities rallied together to create options for their children. So much like this micro school in the San Carlos Apache community, parents in Rapid City, which is my hometown, opened temporary learning pods. And so as a parent, my children joined Wichunchache Owayawa. So Wichunchache means the growth of a generation. Owayawa is school. So we had teachers who taught Lakota language and culture. And the micro school at that time only had 6 young learners, but they were thriving and they took pride in their learning space. As you can see, they were all working together to set up their quiet room. So I'm just going to show you a brief snippet of some of the language learning that these learners engaged with.
Li ambetu he no, it's not he. Kan one tonka mestinchuan he one blanke one blanke mestinchuan he one washte one chinchula washte one lake Li ambetu ki thunkal mestinchula di one bloke mestinchula di washte walaka. So that was my son and my niece both practicing their Lakota. They were talking about a brown bunny rabbit. So sadly, with the COVID completely ravaging our community in South Dakota, Wichunchache did not go unaffected. So families and teachers both got sick, and eventually the micro school had to close its doors. But with any challenge like others, our communities really learned to adapt. We quickly leveraged social media, as I explained earlier, to continue connect with each other and to provide that continued access to language and culture from within our homes. And so what many Indigenous educators and non-Indigenous educators learned was that there was an immediate resurgence in interest and engagement from young people in learning their culture. So we really realized, if schools couldn't prioritize language and culture,
we would provide the spaces to learn our histories and our stories. So social media was a chosen medium because a lot of families still had access to that via their phones. So as I had shared earlier, Indigenous Storytime, this was one such platform that was born out of the pandemic. It was co-founded by myself and other women Indigenous educators. So we share stories from Indigenous nations across Turtle Island, teachers in schools from across the country. They joined our group and they started to ask, can we use your stories in our classrooms? And the Indigenous young people in their classrooms loved it. We had learners from kindergarten all the way into 12th grade who were engaging with their stories and who they are. Also, in terms of language, this has been shared via social media. Ray Taken Alive, a colleague, he's an educator from Standing Rock, he's imploded the language learning landscape because he's really making that demand that our language be accessible for anyone for free, especially our own Indigenous communities. So he's at the forefront of a movement to assert Indigenous data sovereignty so that the only entities who can own Indigenous language and resources are the communities to whom those resources and the language belong to. So he and countless others, they work together on the Lakota Language Reclamation Project. And this is an open education resource for Lakota language learning. So, as schools returned across the United States back to school in person, there was a lot of uncertainty. That need to get back to normal, I think it was really driven by, the isolation fatigue and of course, Zoom fatigue. But many Indigenous families wondered, what does back to normal look like for my children? Will schools continue to marginalize us? Will they require my child to leave a significant piece of their cultural identity at the door? Will they be successful? So parents really began to, again, get together and sought options to prioritize the safety of their children, but also to ensure that the language and culture and stories remained part of their children's learning experience. So POD, another attempt, a small group of us here in Rapid City, myself and two others, were really seizing on the opportunity to reestablish a learning pod. And so unfortunately, we no longer have the organizational support that the original learning pods had. A small group of us continue on a volunteer basis because of our commitment to our community. So we volunteer our time, resources, and space to our vision. As part of this work, we're currently developing our own Lakota-centered curriculum, which centers the Oceti Sakowin essential understandings. And so this curriculum will also be an open educational resource and hopefully a replicable model that other Indigenous communities around the world can adapt. And so the volunteer community members, we utilize Indigenous pedagogies such as oral storytelling, hands-on place-based learning, and we utilize a competency-based assessment system. So, here's a picture of some of our learners in our community garden. Students really learned about the responsibilities of being a good relative, even to our plant relatives. And so we integrate learning content standards such as science, math, and reading into our ways of knowing and our ways of being. Instead of classroom rules, the teachers focus on Indigenous virtues, and we really emphasize the concept of Midakuye Oyasi, we are all related, because this philosophy carries with it a responsibility to treat each other as relatives. And so these practices move away from those punitive structures that historical and contemporary educational systems have placed upon us. It really helps learners understand that every action that we take impacts others. So we begin to realize that we have an obligation to be good relatives, and we always think of the well-being of others. Our learners still access remote learning for math and literacy, but at the heart of their learning is Indigenous culture. And so, of course, to support and enhance cultural teachings, teachers use the Wo'owachi and the 4 quadrants to really help them. We know why we need a tool like Wo'owachi. We know the disparities in education. So we need to create spaces for Indigenous people to access their cultural identity. So through the use of the Oceti Sakowin essential understandings, we know what we need to prioritize. However, educators, learners, and families didn't know how to do this before the Wo'owachi. So the Wo'owachi framework really provides that roadmap and shows educators how to move forward. I'm going to skip through this because of just for time. But I do want to pause for a moment and just share with this, our micro school's vision, because really, as we look toward the future with our new micro school, we keep the story of Iktomi and the ducks in mind. As educators and learners, we're no longer blind. We don't want to be the ducks who keep their eyes closed. We don't want to be subjugated. We don't want to maintain the status quo. Our community, our micro school, we've been told by many people that our model is not viable, and we've been told that we will not be successful. We've run into barriers and challenges, but we don't focus on that. Instead, we seek to be courageous, the courageous duck, ready to open our eyes and spread our wings and fly. So the mission of our micro school is this. We are creating a wholly Indigenous-centered learning environment that nurtures all learners to show up in the world as compassionate, respectful relatives who dream and act with courage. So as I end my time with you, I'd just like to remind you of the importance of stories. Stories teach us how to avoid mistakes, how to treat each other justly and with compassion. Indigenous knowledge systems counter Iktomi's actions. So I invite you all to think of the many ways you can be the courageous duck. How will you show up in your educational spaces and for your communities? What are you going to do to work to keeping your eyes open? So here is my contact information. If you have any other questions, Hana Consulting LLC, in addition to our volunteer micro school work, we do work to support teachers around the country in cultural integration and use of essential understandings through the Wowo Watching. So I think we have just about 5 minutes if there's any parting questions or comments. You're welcome, Diane. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. How I would say thank you in my language to all of you would be Wo'opila Tchanka Chichiapi. Thank you to all of you.